editor of Control and ControlGlobal.com, with another in the Control ARC monthly podcast series. Every month, we look at the issues raised in the cover story in Control with the insights of ARC's analysts. For this month, October 2012, the topic is process security. With me once more is Barry Young, Principal Analyst at ARC. He focuses on DCS and process safety systems. Barry, thanks for joining us again today.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me and ARC.
Well, let's get started. First question, is the chasm between process security and IT security as wide as ever? And if so, how come?
Well, Jim, it may not be as wide as you think. A lot's been written over the last 3 years about automation groups and IT groups and how they can work together. And I think we've made a lot of progress there, and I think it's followed over into the process security, cybersecurity efforts. Today, they're much better. Of course, there are still, some huge differences in the details of how each group works. For example, the asset lifecycle of an IT server is probably 2 to 3 years nowadays, and a DCS system, plant automation system, when it gets put into the plant, that's expected to last 20-plus years. So that, combined with the real-time nature of process control, the 24/7 nature, that makes for some differences. But I think overall each group can learn from each other, and that basically the relationship is getting better and the chasm's not as wide as you might think.
All right, but hasn't the long-time presence of Windows and other IT-based software and systems on the plant floor also narrowed the gap? For example, aren't most process control applications and organizations using patching policies now?
Yes, I think this is just, another example of why the process security and IT security people are working better together. All of the automation suppliers nowadays are using COTS, or commercial off-the-shelf products, in their current systems. And even when they have to get involved with their legacy proprietary systems, they use COTS products as interfaces back to them. So, patches of the operating systems are now a way of life for both the automation people and automation security, as well as, of course, the IT group with the enterprise systems. Of course, as we mentioned, the obvious difference, things like the 24/7 operation make the implementation a little bit more difficult with patches. But it can be done, and again, I think both groups are learning from each other.
Is ARC seeing any other good news on the process security front? For instance, are more users doing risk assessments and segmenting and firewalling their control networks?
Yes, absolutely. I was just reading some recent survey data, and more than half of the end users surveyed in this study have a plan which they believe, they're doing everything possible for security, process security, cybersecurity right now. Another 25% have a plan, and they're in the process of implementing it. So that leaves us with about 25% without a plan, which isn't a good thing. But, overall, those numbers are much better than they were just 3 years ago. The firewalls you mentioned for perimeter security are almost a given today, with a company of any size. And, that's just a way of life, and I think that's part of the story. I think the cybersecurity, process security efforts are much more than just firewalls, but that certainly is part of it, and I think that's a given.
Right. In the cover article itself, unintentional operator errors are once again being blamed for creating exploitable vulnerabilities in process systems. Is this true? And if so, how can users combat this problem?
Well, first of all, having good security policies for both external threats and internal threats are a must. And as I mentioned earlier, more than half the companies surveyed have those plans in place now. But as it turns out, really the internal vulnerabilities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, are the biggest threat to process systems. The firewalls help prevent external attacks, but they're not so good at the internal attacks or the internal inadvertent mistakes. So things like eliminating USB ports that aren't necessary, whitelisting applications, those things can help. But today, there's a lot of software on laptops that gets connected to a system, then disconnected, then reconnected, et cetera. We have this new trend called BYOD, which is bring your own device. People are bringing into the plants their smartphones, their tablets, their own laptops, and the possibility with them, the inadvertent internal threats due to mistakes of using those devices is something that companies are really having to deal with. There's another trend, too, with a lot of new plant equipment coming in that has embedded devices that you may not even know are there sometimes. But in the long run, they have an IP address. Somehow they end up being connected to the internal network, and they become a vulnerable point. So, I guess just in summary, there's a lot of things going on. Probably the internal threats are the most difficult to deal with, and certainly if somebody really wants to, the disgruntled employee, if you will, that's probably one of the most difficult things to deal with.
All right. Are there any new methods for conducting security risk assessments or other new tools for improving process security, and how do they work and where are they being used?
Well, first of all the major automation suppliers have now very active cybersecurity programs. Now, they don't talk about them a lot other than, a one-page brochure kind of thing, because it's due to the nature of the industry that, you don't want to tell the bad guys the details of what you're doing. So if you look for documentation, you'll find overviews, but you won't find a lot of detail out there as to specifics. Now, cybersecurity used to be almost an afterthought a few years ago, but today it is now very much being designed into new products right up front in the R&D phase. And a plan is put in place from R&D, the development, right on through to the end of life of the product when it gets decommissioned. So there are designed-in plans, cybersecurity plans for all these projects nowadays. A lot's also happening with standards. The NIST, ISA-99, IEC, all these standards committees are doing a lot to help out with tools and improving process security.
All right. Well, finally, how is process security likely to evolve in the future, and how can users respond to stay as safe as possible?
Well, certainly process security is here to stay, and it changes daily. It seems like, every week we read about some kind of new threat or some kind of new success from the bad guys, if you will. I mean, it's even right now, you read about it being an active type of warfare. So what can companies do, and what's the future? Well, first of all, they need an active program with upper-level management support, very similar to process safety. I think we've seen process safety be an issue. Cybersecurity and process security is kind of the same thing, and it definitely needs upper management support. The key word here is active. You can't just put in some policies and some software and use the set and forget approach. It needs to be an active program. These threats change daily, and you need to be very much involved all the time. In terms of how it's evolving, I think we're going to see ease of use for these security tools be a big issue. If something is difficult to use, people don't use it. So if it takes a super guru technical guy to implement this rather than the average automation person, then they won't get used. So there's a lot of emphasis now being placed on ease of use for these security tools so that they do get used. Training of plant personnel will become even more important. You know, little things like showing an operator the implications of him playing a game, you know, on the second shift and what that can do to plant security and the implications of it need to be addressed in real terms that operations people and engineering people and technicians can understand. And finally, and we're seeing this, you know, this is not an end user alone solvable problem. It needs to be a collaborative effort between the groups of the users, the suppliers, the vendors supplying the process systems, the consultants that are out there in this space, and some of these standards and government standards that I mentioned earlier. You can't solve this problem in a vacuum, and it needs to be a big collaborative effort by everybody involved.
Okay. Well, listen, Barry, those were some great insights. If I was managing a process control system and wanted to protect it, I would feel more secure already. I think it really fleshed out our cover article. Thanks for talking to us today.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having us.
This has been another in the monthly Control ARC podcast series. I'm Jim Montague. Thanks for listening.